I didn't know you owned a skirt like that, Tyler said, his voice caught somewhere between a nervous chuckle and genuine surprise. I glanced up from where I was adjusting the hem of my miniskirt, feeling both amused and slightly self-conscious. Tyler, my 22-year-old nephew, stood frozen in the doorway of the living room, holding a plate of cookies meant for the family gathering. His cheeks flushed as his gaze darted to the floor. It's just a skirt, Tyler, I said with a teasing smile, trying to ease the awkwardness. Don't tell me you're one of those people who think women my age should stick to yoga pants and long sweaters. He stammered something unintelligible before laughing nervously. No, you look great. It's just different, that's all. The family barbecue was in full swing outside. Laughter, the clinking of plates, and the sizzle of burgers on the grill filled the air. My brother, Tyler's dad, was manning the grill while the rest of the family lounged on patio chairs, enjoying the warm afternoon. But I had stepped inside for a moment, relishing the brief solitude away from the bustling energy of the backyard. Tyler had always been the quiet one in the family, a bookish, introverted young man who seemed to prefer the company of his laptop over people. As his aunt, I'd always tried to bring him out of his shell, but our conversations rarely ventured beyond safe topics like his college courses or his latest tech projects. Yet now, standing there in my living room, he seemed different. Unsettled. I guess I've had it for a while, I said, brushing imaginary lint off the fabric. It's not like I wear it every day. Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen you wear something like that before, he said, finally stepping further into the room and placing the cookies on the coffee table. His movements were slow, almost hesitant, as though he were trying to mask a deeper discomfort. I studied him for a moment, noticing things I hadn't paid much attention to before, the way he avoided meeting my eyes, the way his hands fidgeted with the edge of his t-shirt. What's wrong, Tyler? I asked, my tone softening. You seem off today. He hesitated, his eyes briefly flicking to mine before darting away again. Nothing's wrong. Never mind. It's nothing. I raised an eyebrow but decided not to push. The last thing I wanted was to make him feel more uncomfortable. All right, if you say so. But you know you can talk to me about anything, right? He nodded quickly, muttering, yeah, I know. Then, with a rushed excuse about checking on the grill, he disappeared back outside, leaving me standing there with a strange knot in my chest. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully, or at least, it appeared that way on the surface. I joined the others in the backyard, chatting with my siblings and keeping an eye on the younger kids splashing around in the inflatable pool. But every so often, I'd catch Tyler glancing in my direction, his expression unreadable. By the time the sun began to set, casting the backyard in a golden glow, most of the family had either left or moved inside to escape the cooling air. I found myself alone on the patio, nursing a glass of iced tea and watching the last remnants of the day fade into twilight. It was peaceful, yet I couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. Tyler's behavior had been strange all day, and though I told myself it was probably nothing, a case of youthful awkwardness exacerbated by a harmless wardrobe choice, something about it didn't sit right with me. The screen door creaked open, and I turned to see Tyler stepping out onto the patio, his hands shoved into his pockets. He seemed to hesitate before walking over and sitting in the chair beside me. Everyone's gone inside, he said, his voice quieter than usual. Looks like it's just us then, I replied, offering him a small smile. He didn't return it. Instead, he stared out at the horizon, his jaw tight. Aunt Sarah, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Can I ask you something? His tone sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the casual, easygoing Tyler I knew. It was something else, something heavier. Of course, I said, keeping my voice steady even as my pulse quickened. He hesitated again, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Then he looked at me, his eyes searching mine as though trying to decide whether he could trust me with whatever he was about to say. What would you do, he asked slowly, if you found out someone in the family was keeping a secret, something big? I blinked, caught off guard. Well, I suppose it would depend on the secret. Is this about you, Tyler? He didn't answer immediately, his gaze dropping to his lap. When he finally spoke, his words were so soft I almost didn't hear them. Maybe. The air between us grew heavy, charged with unspoken tension. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to be simple. And as I looked at him, at the boy I'd watched grow into a man, now sitting before me with a storm brewing behind his eyes, I realized that this moment, whatever it was leading to, would change everything. Tyler's words hung in the air between us, thick with implication. The warm glow of the setting sun had faded, leaving the patio awash in shadow. Crickets chirped faintly in the distance, their rhythmic song an oddly soothing contrast to the turmoil brewing in my chest. Tyler, I began cautiously, leaning forward in my seat. If there's something you need to say, you can say it. You know that, right? He nodded, his shoulders stiff as though bracing for impact. For a long moment, he didn't speak, his gaze fixed firmly on the ground. I waited, the silence stretching thin, until finally, he lifted his eyes to meet mine. It's just, he started, then faltered, his voice breaking slightly. It's hard to explain. Take your time, I said gently, though my pulse quickened with every passing second. Tyler took a deep breath, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. Do you ever feel like there's something about yourself you can't share with anyone? He asked, his voice low. Like if people knew, they'd never look at you the same way again? The question struck a chord deep within me. I had my own share of secrets, things I'd buried over the years to keep the peace, to protect myself. But this wasn't about me. This was about him. Everyone has things they're afraid to share, I replied carefully. But sometimes, keeping it all inside does more harm than good. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You don't get it. This isn't just some little thing I can brush off or pretend doesn't exist. It's complicated. Then help me understand, I urged. He hesitated, his jaw working as though he were trying to force the words out. When they finally came, they were a whisper, barely audible over the night's quiet hum. I don't think I'm who everyone thinks I am. The weight of his confession hit me like a tidal wave, though its meaning remained elusive. I leaned closer, searching his face for clues, for context. What do you mean by that? He opened his mouth to respond but froze when the screen door creaked open. My brother, his father, stepped out onto the patio, a beer in hand and an easy smile on his face. There you two are, he said, his voice breaking the fragile tension like glass. What are you doing out here all quiet and serious? Did I miss something? Tyler immediately straightened in his chair, the vulnerability in his expression vanishing like a curtain dropping on a stage. No, nothing, he said quickly, too quickly. We were just talking. My brother raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. Instead, he joined us on the patio, settling into one of the chairs with a contented sigh. Well, don't stay out here too long, he said, pointing toward the house. Mom's asking about dessert, and you know how she gets when things run late. Tyler gave a stiff nod, and my brother disappeared back inside, leaving us alone once more. But the moment was lost, the delicate thread of our conversation severed. Tyler, I said softly, but he was already standing, his movements hurried and almost frantic. I need some air, he muttered, heading for the yard before I could stop him. I sat there for a moment, torn between giving him space and following after him. Something about his demeanor, his trembling hands, his hunched shoulders, set off alarm bells in my mind. I couldn't leave things like this, not when he was clearly struggling. Rising from my chair, I followed him, my footsteps soft on the dewy grass. I found him standing at the edge of the yard, staring out into the darkness with his arms wrapped tightly around himself. Tyler, I said again, my voice firm yet gentle. He flinched but didn't turn around. I'm sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I shouldn't have said anything. You don't have to apologize, I said, stepping closer. But you can't keep running from this. Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone. He turned then, his eyes glistening in the dim light. I'm scared, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The raw vulnerability in his expression was almost too much to bear. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. You're not alone, I said firmly. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together. For a moment, he looked like he might say more, but then he shook his head, pulling away from my touch. I can't, he said, his voice breaking. Not here. Not now. Then when? I pressed, desperate to keep the connection alive. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in the dark, my heart heavy with unspoken questions. As I watched him retreat into the shadows, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that whatever secret he was carrying would soon come crashing into the light, changing everything in its wake. The next morning brought with it a quiet tension. The house hummed with the usual holiday chaos, breakfast preparations, laughter spilling from the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, but my thoughts were fixed on Tyler. He hadn't come back to the patio after our conversation, and though I'd seen him slip into the house late that night, the shadows under his eyes at breakfast spoke of a restless night. I found him later that day sitting on the front porch, his knees pulled up to his chest as he stared out at the gravel driveway. The cold wind rustled his hair, but he didn't seem to notice. "Tyler," I said softly, easing the screen door shut behind me. "Can we talk?" He didn't look at me but nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. I sat beside him, letting the silence stretch as I waited for him to speak first. "I don't know how to start," he admitted after a long pause, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Start with what feels right," I encouraged. "There's no wrong way to say it." He took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edges of the porch step. "I've been hiding something for a long time," he said, his voice trembling. "Something I've been too afraid to tell anyone." I didn't respond, letting the weight of his words settle between us. "I like guys," he said suddenly, his words rushing out in a single breath. "I'm gay." The confession hung in the air, raw and unpolished. Tyler's eyes stayed fixed on the gravel driveway, his jaw clenched as though bracing for an explosion. "Thank you for telling me," I said gently. His head snapped toward me, his expression a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. "That's it?" he asked. "You're not mad? Disappointed?" "Of course not," I said, my voice firm. "Why would I be?" "Tyler, this doesn't change who you are to me. It just means I know a little more about the real you now." His shoulders sagged with relief, and for the first time in days, he smiled, a small, tentative curve of his lips that made my heart ache. "I've been so scared to tell anyone," he admitted. "Dad. He's not exactly the most understanding person." "I know," I said carefully. "But this isn't about him. This is about you and living your truth. You don't have to hide who you are, not from me, not from anyone." "But what if they don't accept me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Then that's on them, not you," I said firmly. "You deserve to be loved and accepted for who you are, not who people think you should be." His eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, he looked like the little boy I used to babysit, the one who used to climb onto my lap when the world felt too big. "Thank you," he whispered. I reached out, pulling him into a hug. He hesitated for a moment before leaning into me, his head resting on my shoulder. "You're braver than you think," I said softly. For a while, we just sat there, the wind carrying away the tension that had lingered between us for so long. When he finally pulled away, his expression was lighter, freer. "I think I want to tell Dad," he said quietly. "Not today, but someday. I'll be there with you when you're ready," I promised. The rest of the day passed in a haze of warmth and connection. Tyler seemed more at ease, laughing with the family and even joining in on the card games after dinner. The shift in him was subtle but unmistakable. A weight had been lifted, and he was finally beginning to breathe again. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey we'd both taken. Tyler's courage had reminded me of the importance of living authentically, of embracing the messiness of human connection. Life was far from perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Tyler had taken the first step toward freedom, and I had been there to witness it, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for the people we love is simply to listen.